You're watching theAnalysis-news, and I'm your host, Talia Baroncelli. I'll shortly be joined by journalist Ioan Grillo to speak about how the U.S. arms cartels throughout Latin America. If you'd like to support the work that we do, you can go to our website, theAnalysis.news, hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen, and make sure you get onto our mailing list. That way you're always notified every time a new episode is published. You can also like and subscribe to the show on YouTube or on other podcast streaming services such as Apple or Spotify. See you in a bit with Ioan Grillo. Joining me now is journalist Ioan Grillo. He's currently based in Mexico City and has been reporting from Mexico for over 20 years. He's the author of several books, including El Narco and Blood, Gun, Money. It's really great to have you today. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, great to be here.
So your most recent book, Blood, Gun, Money, is really interesting because it identifies how so many weapons that are in the hands of cartel men or cartelitos, as you like to call some of them, as well as other criminals in Mexico and other parts of South America, actually come from the U.S. So they're produced in the U.S. And you sort of trace this web of how these weapons proliferate throughout the globe, but particularly throughout Latin America. So my first question would be, what got you into reporting on this specific topic of guns and the way guns are manufactured and illicitly sold to different parts of South America to drive cartel war? Because you've been reporting on so many aspects of the drug wars in South America. So I just wonder, what really made you hone in on that particular topic of guns?
Yeah, sure thing. So, like I said, I've been reporting on this now for 23 years. I've been in Mexico and seeing this catastrophic violence, which really rose up in the time that I was here. And I found myself, first reporting what was kind of a fun, exotic crime story of these, like these crazy gangsters who had songs about them and made billions of dollars moving cocaine and managed to escape the DA and the Mexican army. And then it turned into kind of reporting on a humanitarian catastrophe, mass graves with 300 bodies, families devastated, their sons, daughters dragged away and murdered. And I knew about the guns issue from early on, right back, I used to work for the Houston Chronicle out of Houston, Texas. Right back then, 19, 20 years ago, I was writing stories about the gun trafficking. But I thought, well, America's got a Second Amendment. What more is there to say? The guns come down here to Mexico, and what can we do about it? And then in 2017, I managed to get an interview in the Ciudad Juarez, in the prison there with a gun trafficker. And he described in detail how he was trafficking firearms and was driving up from the state of Chihuahua in Mexico to Dallas every weekend and buying a dozen or so AR-15s mostly and taking them back. And described how he was doing it and saying he was actually doing this, buying them at the gun shows with no paperwork whatsoever. Completely described this kind of black market in the gun show. So I thought, that's kind of interesting. How's this really working? And then so I went to the gun show in one of these gun shows in Dallas where he was buying from and recorded the conversations with people and realized there was this kind of two sides of the business there. One, there was the kind of regular gun shops who were working at the gun shows who would still ask for ID and a background check. But the other was these people who were selling brand new guns for nothing, which he described as a black market in the gun shows. And it sometimes gets into what's called as the private sale loophole, where people are selling guns, saying that, like, I'm a regular collector and I'm going to sell you the gun with no ID. Like, if I'm an old record collector, I can sell you a record or some of my old books. I can sell you some of my old books. I don't need any paperwork. But these were selling brand new guns. So I thought, wow, this is actually a pretty interesting subject. And start talking to many, even of the pro-gun people, the gun sellers, who are like, no, we don't like the idea of massive amounts of firearms being sold to drug cartels who are carrying out mass murder in Mexico. Then found one gun seller who himself had become a confidential informant for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. I was recording sales and kind of looking into this thing. So I realized this is a really big issue. It's not as simple as the Second Amendment. You can still have perfectly good defensive gun rights, but try and reduce selling to the firearm, to the cartels. Then the numbers started coming out of how big this problem is. And we started seeing, it's more than 200,000 guns a year going to the cartels. So the last decade, more than 2 million firearms. One of the biggest episodes of gun trafficking, what effectively is like a hybrid armed conflict in Mexico. And so, that's when I got into this kind of 4-year odyssey of trying to get into the, try to be going with a certain humility of stepping into the American firearms industry, the American gun debate, but to go right into this issue.
Right, and I think in your book you mentioned that between 2007 and I think it was 2018, over 150,000 guns were definitively traced back to the U.S., guns that had been used by Mexican criminals and cartel men. So you're saying that a lot of the guns come from private sales, but I'm sure some of them are also a result of straw purchases. Is that something that you found out as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was the two biggest methods that the cartels get the guns from the United States was this private sales, which again, they're not really private sales. These are gun traffickers abusing the kind of private sale idea to sell quite large amounts of guns. And you've got cases of people selling, more than 1,000 firearms, buying and selling guns. So they're really engaged in the business of selling firearms. But also straw buying, straw purchasing. So straw purchasing, if somebody's got a clean ID, I asked, Talia, can you go and buy me a firearm? You got a driver's license here. You got no bad criminal record for violence. Go to the store. I'm going to give you, here's $700 to the cost of the AR-15 or cost of the AK-47 plus $100 for yourself. And people were doing that. Now, why is it? One of the things that grabbed my attention with this, you start seeing is why is it such a small amount of money? One case, a guy walks into the store and he buys 10 AK-47s, identical AK-47s. So there's obviously something up. Why would you go, no, I'll have 10 Waza 10, the guns called the Romanian AK-47s. Borders in a store in Texas. You're buying 10 of the same rifle. It's kind of weird unless you just want 10 of the same rifle. So something's up. But he bought those to sell to a cartel. And he was given $600 fee plus the cost of the rifle. So he made $60 a gun. So a pretty small amount of money. In that case, one of the guns was used in the killing of a U.S. agent in Mexico, as well as these guns are used for mass murder. And he was arrested, bound for it. His crime, lying on the floor. His sentence, probation. Nothing. So even people involved in very clearly proven cases were getting no jail time. And that was one of the reasons why straw buying was such an easy thing. And you had cases of, people buying more than 500 guns in single sales. Incredible stuff. People going around and spending $500,000 on 750 firearms in different stores, going store to store to store to store. People buying big guns like 50, rifles that fire 50 cal bullets and all of these kind of things. So it's kind of amazing the scale of it. It's like really low hanging fruit of just like, again, it's like not even about the Second Amendment. It's like, how come you're so openly and so easily allowing these guns to go to these such violent organizations?
Well, something that you mentioned, which struck me as really fascinating, I didn't realize this actually, was that, the U.S. has laws which can prosecute drug running across the border, drug trafficking, but it doesn't have the same sort of legal framework or regulations to prosecute the trafficking of guns en masse. So they, for example, could get people for smaller violations such as engagement in firearms businesses without a license, or as we were already talking about, straw purchases or knowing sale to a prohibited person, that sort of thing. And you also document that because you attended the trial of El Chapo in, I think it was 2019. And this was, a part of the trial is that they were able to get him on drug trafficking and other similar charges, but there were no mass guns trafficking or gun running against him and other members of his organization. So I'm wondering, why do you think that is? Is that perhaps a result of some of the gun lobbying in the U.S.? Because your book is about blood, gun, money, how America arms guns and cartels. So perhaps there is some sort of incentive there to prevent certain legislation from being enacted.
Yeah, absolutely. So I went to some of the trial of El Chapo, which was, after covering things here for many years, it was kind of surreal and crazy. I mean, you suddenly see these kind of guys, a bit like a superstar. And the US, a lot of the US media were kind of enjoying and finding the kind of fun trial of this kind of guy out there. But, also, for the men who've seen the violence the last 20 years, are like, well, yeah, it's kind of fun, but also this guy has been involved in a mass murder down here. But it was very interesting. They brought the guns out. They brought the AK-47s. They brought the grenade launchers. They brought them into the courthouse. And they said, this guy is trafficking 1,500, 2,000 AK-47s down. He's like arming this war in Mexico. They made that case verbally in the trial, but they didn't have him charged. When I discovered there was no federal conspiracy for trafficking firearms, and I was like, wow, how come we don't know this? This is kind of really weird. And then, what do these people get charged for with firearms cases? And so, a lot of the time is, let's say, lying on the form. And that's why the case is so low. Now, I must say, this is a big turn. I wrote all this in the conclusion of my book, published in 2021, how this was the case. And they need federal firearms laws, higher sentences on straw purchases. Now, in 2022, in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in the United States, they actually made a change. I don't want to make an overclaim it was my book which caused the change, but I do know that some of the assistants of the Congress, people involved in this, have been emailing me and asking me for stuff and various things. So maybe it could be involved in this. This went down quite quietly, and the American media didn't really spot or see these changes, mostly because this Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was also focused on the mass shooters, people going to schools and spraying them up, Parkland style, spraying up kids, and the media were very focused on those points rather than on this gun trafficking. But they actually made, for the first time, federal conspiracy to traffic firearms, and have started charging some people with those since then. So it's kind of a game changer, or we'd hope. One of the things that we need to see is you can pass laws, but you still have to see them enforced, and you still have to see kind of things happening to try and make an effort with this. The conversation's been changed in a big way. Now, we also had in 2021, in late 2021, the Mexican government suing the U.S. firearms companies over this firearms trafficking. So that was a big change. They also cited my book in that lawsuit. So that was a big change as well, which really changed the conversation, has made it much more in the media. So we've seen it kind of change in the conversation. We've seen certain changes in laws, but we would have to see change in the action to see if this problem actually, we kind of resolve this or reduce the firepower of the cartels.
Well, we live in an incredibly violent society, and a lot of the violence is driven by gun makers who receive state subsidies from the U.S. government or even from other governments, such as the German government. And in your book, you also discuss the case of peace activist Ioan Grillo. So for many years, Ioan Grillo has been campaigning against the really large gun manufacturer Heckler & Koch. Heckler & Koch has been manufacturing assault rifles, such as G36 rifles, for many years. And he suspected that these guns were ending up in the hands of criminals and other violent actors across the world in really dangerous areas in which human rights violations were being committed. But this was very difficult for him to prove. And as a result of some evidence published by whistleblowers, he was able to get a Stuttgart court to fine Heckler & Koch for $3.4 million for their sale of G36 assault rifles to the Mexican government, which ended up selling some of these weapons to other parts of the country, and Heckler and Koch guns were then actually used in the killing of 43 student teachers in 2014 in Guerrero. So it was as a result of this particular case that Heckler and Koch was sued. But what do you think needs to change on a more macro level in order to reverse some of the incentive structures of producing these guns?
Yeah, his case is a very important case. I went there to interview him in Freiburg, and I went to the H&K factory up in the mountains there. It's kind of, it's bizarre. You've got this, beautiful mountains and the Black Forest in this little town, producing millions of guns that end up in the hands of cartels in Mexico, in all of these conflicts around the world, just churning out these firearms. So yeah, it's now the bigger issue there is very, very difficult. And so people ask, can you actually stop the cartels getting guns? What can you really do with that? Can you have, so in Mexico, you have these many organizations, they have this endless stream of AK-47s, AR-15s, 50 cals, grenades, all of these weapons that they're using for this kind of terror and using for these things. And working with corrupt police and corrupt military and so forth. How can you really turn that around and stop that? Well, then other people come around and say, well, it's never going to be able to stop it. The only way is to give everybody guns. And then the more guns would actually make it more peaceful, because then everyone, and you realize in Mexico that doesn't necessarily work, because even if I work around these places, work around these super violent places, and even if I have a pistol with me or an AK-47, then there's groups, 30, 40 of these guys with AK-47s. I'm not going to, outgun them. So, I mean, there's sometimes such Herculean problems in how you really solve this. I think in some ways, you have to just look at what's happening right now and how we can do and react to some of these things right now. So, with the fact is the US gun shops and gun factories and gun distributors, because someone's bringing European guns, Romanian, AK-47s, they're not made in the US, but they're imported to the United States, sold in the United States, and then taken to Mexico. Try and challenge that, and especially in this time when we've got, at least try and reduce, even if you're not going to say they've got no guns, reduce that flow of firearms. One of the problems when there's such an excess of guns, because they have so many guns, they use a gun to crime. It's a bit of a hot gun, they call it. They call it quebrado. The gun's been burned because it's been used in pretty high-profile crime. So they'll sell it real cheap for like $100. And so the kids, the younger kids in the neighborhoods have got all guns as well. They're getting, thrown down. So kids in school have got guns, schools have got guns and all this kind of stuff. So you've got such an excess of bullets where they don't only just fire on the target, but they'll fire 500 bullets and kill the person they're going after, and the guy selling tacos on the side of the street, and the pregnant woman driving in the car behind. So you kind of have to have some kind of reduction of this violence to start somewhere. Now, I don't want to let Mexico off the hook. Mexican government is massively corrupt and working with cartels. Mexico needs to figure out some kind of strategy of reducing violence in this country. But on this issue of gun trafficking from the United States, the Mexican government is right on this issue, and has a moral high ground of saying, well, you can't just give this iron river of guns and let it flow to the criminals here in this country.
Well, I think it's a very complex issue. We can call so many issues complex, but this particular issue ties in with the flow of resources, as you call it, the Iron River, so the stream of guns to Latin America. But it's, these weapons are used to ensure that there is a drug trade. And part of the reason that there is a drug trade is because drugs are criminalized and not legalized. And so I also wonder how much of this is really kind of driven by Nixon's version of the war on drugs. And we've seen various manifestations of that over the years. This policy of trying to cut the supply of drugs, but in a way propping up a whole system, a whole apparatus around it, which actually fuels all of this violence and, the power structures that maintain these drug cartels. And we could even go as far and say that the U.S. government supports various regimes throughout South America and Central America which are also actually doing a lot of the drug running themselves. So someone is profiting from all of this. So it's probably not adequate to just analyze one part of the problem and say that we just need to target the guns. But it seems like there is an incentive structure there to keep things as they are and to not actually challenge the entire problem. And I mean, it's my own personal bias, but I think that if you would at least decriminalize and also legalize a lot of these drugs, then that would turn things on its head for the cartels.
Yeah, so some deep issues there. So absolutely, the illegal gun trafficking and the illegal drug trade are totally entangled. So it's like these two venomous plants entangled around each other. A lot, and you see there's so many levels. You see people selling heroin in Baltimore, or now selling more synthetic opioids in Baltimore. People come in from Virginia and they'll trade guns for drugs. You see the Mexican cartels bringing guns down from the US all the way down to Colombia and exchanging them for cocaine. And then the guns are used in this, been used to fuel a civil war in Colombia for many years. So you see this exchange of guns and drugs. And then because the drug trade is such high money and many people can do it, then who actually dominates the trade? People with more guns and violence. So you use guns to defend your turf in the drug trade. And, whereas the illegal gun trade is worth a relatively small number of total dollars, though some people still get very rich from this, the illegal drug trade, they say, is worth more than $300 billion per year around the world. Now, questions of drug policy reform. Well, actually, I'll get to the last question, then get to drug policy reform. You mentioned about the US government itself supporting regimes or governments, groups involved in drug trafficking. Very, very big issue, very relevant issue. It's like the US government is having a war on drugs and self-sabotaging the war on drugs, whether through some kind of policy or just this ineptness. Big cases like Afghanistan, where you saw, not just the US, but all of the allies in Afghanistan, and the biggest heroin state in the world for many years. The Taliban are coming in and start, some horrific stuff from the Taliban, but also start clamping down on poppies. And then weird things of the US government criticizing the Taliban for clamping down on poppies. Very weird politics to understand. And you see this again and again. Going way back, Vietnam. In Vietnam, actually South Vietnam was involved in drug trafficking, the state being done there. The secret army in Laos, a CIA-funded secret army, also moving heroin, moving poppers, getting the US soldiers addicted, going back to the US, and then bringing this addiction problems. And you see this again and again. And we go to the Contras in Nicaragua in the 1980s, the Contra army against the Sandinista government, and the Contras getting cocaine money. So you see again and again, there's the US kind of self-sabotaging its own war on drugs, or politics overriding that, which is again is a real problem. On to the drug policy reform, and I've been now involved in this for 23 years. I grew up in an area. I grew up in the city of Brighton in the UK. A lot of drug use back in the 1980s. I knew 4 guys, teenagers or young men, who died of heroin overdoses back then. We had our own opioid epidemic back in the day then. I initially had a lot. I was thinking, legalization is this kind of silver bullet which will solve this. We can kind of legalize it. In 2012, I wrote op-eds in the New York Times, very clearly arguing for legalizing marijuana. This is going to hit the cartels, take the marijuana money away from them. We get to now, and I have more disillusionment about this, and I explain why on where I am with the kind of thinking. One thing is that the marijuana money being taken away hasn't weakened the cartels, unfortunately. And I still believe in marijuana legalization. But the cartels are moving to other drugs and moving to everything else, from extortion to kidnapping to human smuggling, to sex trafficking, to oil theft, to all of these different crimes. I still think marijuana should be legalized, like I say, but I kind of was hoping this would have bigger impact in weakening the cartels then. And then we had this revolution. I do believe it's been a revolution in drugs, from plant-based drugs to synthetic drugs. In the last few years, this has really accelerated. It is kind of coming for a while. We have synthetic drugs going back a long time. But then we really start to see the last couple of years. First, we see crystal meth, and then we see them selling more crystal meth and cocaine, and then more fentanyl than heroin. And the numbers just absolutely going off the chart. So now, now we see, more than 107,000 overdose deaths in the United States in a single year, about 70% with fentanyl in their system. Devastating. You go back to the crack epidemic in the 1980s, the worst years of the crack epidemic, there was 5,000 overdoses. There was other issues of shootings and problems in communities, but the level of overdose deaths now is off the chart. I just wonder what the hell we do about fentanyl. Now it seems sadly that heroin was the good old days. I still totally believe we're in a conversation about drug policy reform, about what should we have as drug policy in our societies, in America, in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, in Germany, particularly big consumption. With cocaine, what can we legalize and decriminalize? But I'm less optimistic that it's such a magic bullet. And also I realize now the actual business of drug policy reform is kind of like we got to marijuana and then we kind of got a bit stuck here. The kind of discussions kind of dissolved. Totally agree. We need a big conversation about this. A little bit less sure of myself what exactly, the moving forward should be.
But we don't really have a case in which there are ideal circumstances or conditions for that. Yes, of course, many countries, or Canada, for example, and then different parts of the US have legalized or decriminalized marijuana, but they haven't done so with all drugs to see how that would affect, drug trafficking, how that would affect the cartels. But I just do remember that Roberto Saviano, who is this writer, I'm sure you're familiar with his work, he was sort of, I guess you could say, undercover with Camorra, with some of the Italian mafia in and around Naples, and he was in a way a whistleblower. He came out of that experience and was able to, based on his statements, was able to get a lot of Neapolitan mafia guys behind bars. But he's interviewed lots of or several crime bosses who are now in jail or who are willing to actually speak to journalists. And a lot of them did say that if drugs were to be legalized, and that would totally upend the business that these mafia guys are conducting, and that would, in a way, it would also result in more taxes being paid and more of a sort of, regulation of the entire flow of weapons and drugs. And that would essentially help Italy as well. It would increase their growth and the amount that they're able to get from taxes and that sort of thing. So to hear that from someone who was so deeply, from criminals essentially, who were so deeply embedded in the mafia and in drug trade, say that one of the biggest threats that they perceive to their business would be something like legalization and decriminalization. I'm sure it means something, but of course we haven't had those conditions to see how it would work in practice. So I take your point that it's not the silver bullet, or it's not the one-size-fits-all policy for all the problems that we have that are related to the drug trade. But I did want to move on to one other issue that I think is really important. And, we've seen so many deaths in Mexico, and you term it a hybrid conflict because it's not officially categorized as an armed conflict by many other countries. So that means that asylum seekers from Mexico some of them get asylum, but not all of them are recognized as refugees because the conditions in Mexico are not really labeled as an armed conflict. And I just wonder how you think that plays into some of these issues and, issues at the border, for example, between US and Mexico.
Yeah, sure thing. So basically, I'll go into something just to say, like, yeah, look, on saying with the drug issue, as I've been, for a long time, and it's not like, I pushed for a long time with these kind of legalization stuff, and so I got quite disillusioned in not seeing this kind of thing stuck, this debate stuck, and one thing, we have a lot of kind of popular opinions saying, well, we should end the war on drugs, kind of legalize stuff. Then you kind of have to really move into legislation. And then with it's kind of, I totally agree, we haven't tried a full-on legalization, and we have examples like Portugal, which have certainly been successful. Models of Portugal, and there certainly needs to be a lot of stuff in terms of health stuff. But just saying, it's not as, it's a complicated, difficult issue. And so really, for example, if we're going to look in the United States, what do you push to legalize or decriminalize first? How do we do this? And sometimes what we end up with in the US is you end up with the drug market being decriminalized, being that you can consume drugs without being punished, and I think that's kind of fair enough, but the selling of the drugs still being controlled by cartels. And that's one of the things with kind of decriminalization, but still allowing it in their hands. So that's the thing there. Benno, on to what you're saying.
Right. Thanks for bringing up the Portugal case, because that's actually an example of things working in a very limited context, of course. It's not the whole of Europe, so there are still issues in other parts of Europe, but Portugal has been quite successful in legalizing drugs.
Absolutely, or decriminalizing the thing. And I think, one of the reasons I think that Portugal has success where parts of the US has failed with this is because they still also have a health system in Portugal.
Yeah.
So people can get kind of help, medical help, and kind of rehabilitation help. Whereas in the US, and if you look a lot of some of these West Coast cities, there's just like a lot of people with no health help at all. So some people are taking, fentanyl on the street and so forth, but they've got no real backup or support for actually helping them get out of this. But anyway, going to we said about the conflict. So you have these across Latin America, we've had this violence in a bunch of countries, and so you have Mexico. We've had Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Colombia, Venezuela, with a lot of these same issues where you have criminals have become a form of paramilitary organized crime. And they're like, rather than being gang members, these are like paramilitary organizations with people with, radios, AK-47s, structures, who are taking over and being like a duopoly of power in these areas. And then a lot of people fleeing that violence. So people at the beginning started, when people started becoming aware of the ability to claim asylum for this, they started coming with these cases of what I'm fleeing these organizations. Now, the original asylum law going back to the 1950s and the refugee treaties and so forth were very much geared to more kind of thinking about things like the Holocaust. So they were like, we're looking out for governments that are really repressive, and we're looking out for persecuted ethnic minorities, like obviously the case of the Jews in Germany. And people were, look back and said, how come these people were not given refugees, were not able to be refugees anyway?
Well, just to add some important context, in 1951, when the Geneva Refugee Convention was created, it had a geographical demarcation or requirement, and it was primarily for Europe. And then that later got expanded in 1967 to include refugees coming from elsewhere. So it was really a product of, the outcome of World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust. And it was really specific to Europeans, essentially. But then that was broadened out. And I think Mexico has also played a large role in shaping asylum laws and pushing for the broadening out of that asylum body of law.
Yeah. So absolutely. So then you see, in these cases, so people are saying, well, we're going to argue that these cartels and these gangs, the law was beefed up to show the government being repressive or a persecuted group. So, well, these gangs are effectively working with governments.
Right.
So that because in Mexico, if the Sinaloa cartel wants to kill you, and the Sinaloa cartel has massive amounts of the police and military working for them, then you have to leave the country. Your government is not protecting you, and you're effectively being persecuted by the state. So people will go into the United States and arguing these cases in courts and start to have a success rate in this, getting successful cases and winning asylum on these bases. So then what you got was you had this massive increase, and this was kind of what the judges at the beginning were quite apprehensive about trying to grant asylum in these cases. And people fleeing China would get it much more, is kind of further away. And one of the reasons, I think, what people say that one of the reasons was the judges were apprehensive about awarding asylum in these cases. Like, we're going to open the floodgates if we start giving asylum to people from Mexico, Latin America. Now, but they had good lawyers like Carlos Spector, a lawyer in El Paso, a very good lawyer, arguing these cases and bringing in experts and showing this quite well, and people were given these cases. So then you got this massive increase in asylum claims. And also there was a lot of, people like the United Nations Refugee Agency kind of going around handing out leaflets, giving people a lot, raising the people's understanding of asylum cases.
Which is also their right. It's their right to be informed as to what their rights are under the asylum rubric.
And so then a big backlash in the United States. So first a backlash in Trump, and then this kind of big back and forth on this. Now, what you see right now, or you've seen now, the numbers of asylum seekers going so high in the United States, you've now got backlog. I mean, last time I checked, it was 1.5 million cases backlog. Probably a lot higher now. It goes up very, 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 very steep rise there. Large amounts of people. A lot of people come from Venezuela, continue to come from Cuba, but from across Latin America. So immigration here in Mexico has changed massively. And when I first began covering this a couple of decades ago, it was the vast majority of Mexicans, and they'll go over the Sonora Desert. Now it's less than a quarter of those going over are Mexican, about 3/4 from outside Mexico, mostly from Latin America, and these cases with similar stuff coming from Jamaica, from Haiti, from Honduras, from Nicaragua, from all of these different countries, and also people come from further afield, and then going through. So now you've got the situation where you've had these various attempts. You had the attempts under Trump to try and slow this down. Very confused situation of asylum law. Now, I was just yesterday, came from Ciudad Juarez. I was just talking to give you an example of how confused and how complicated this now is on the border. So I just talked to, I went to a kind of camp of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants. There was a kind of camp of tents and stuff on the border. Met some Venezuelans who were planning to go over. For a time, they would get over the river next to the wall, past this barbed wire, and then the US would say, okay, we're going to process you and allow your asylum claim. Because of the back and forth, suddenly they're saying, no, we're not going to do it anymore. And so, I met these guys in the camp on Saturday. On Sunday, I was sitting on the plane about to go back, and the guy called me in a video call right from where he was in the war. And he was like, no, they're not letting us come in. There's a big thing here. So they're constantly changing the games, changing the rules. And so you see people get pushed further out to the desert to try and go in a very chaotic situation of a lot of people, very, record numbers at the border, but unclear policies of what the rules are. And this becoming a hot political issue, which could, even tip the election in favor of Trump in this year's elections.
Well, there are a lot of issues there because I think the Republicans want the border to be something that they can campaign on. So I don't think they actually want to improve the situation. And, when you talk about a crisis, there are different perspectives on this. Some activists would say that it's also a crisis for people on the move who are trying to claim asylum. So it's not just a crisis of nation states dealing with, people on their borders, but also for the people themselves who are living through this. And you mentioned that there's confused set of laws, and under Trump, I mean, the Supreme Court tried, or the various courts that were dealing with asylum were enacting laws which were really in contravention with a lot of more international asylum laws and international conventions, because they were enacting what's called safe third country principles, saying that, if you're coming from, say, Honduras, and then you're in Mexico, and if Mexico is considered to be a safe country, then you should actually be applying for asylum there, and your asylum claim in the U.S. would be thrown out because you pass through a safe country. But it goes both ways, but most scholars would argue that sort of contravenes the right to asylum in itself, because there could be various reasons for someone seeking asylum in the U.S. and not feeling safe to do so in Mexico. Perhaps they're also being persecuted there, or they're affected by some of the violence there. But that really, I guess, goes into the weeds. But I just see the whole thing as, I mean, there are legitimate problems, of course. There's a huge backlash, or backlog rather, with the courts and not enough people processing asylum claims. So there's a huge backlog where people just be waiting for years and years in the U.S., waiting for a determination to be made on their case. But I also think that some of the policies just exacerbate the issues. And, they say that people should be coming in through official ports of entries. And if that doesn't happen, they're pushed further into the desert to try and cross there, and then end up endangering their lives. So I think the authorities definitely make it worse. And then this standoff with the governor in Texas, with Greg Abbott, and, the state forces versus the federal government, it doesn't really actually help the people on the ground and the people who are searching for somewhere to stay or for asylum. But I guess my final question would be, what do you make of AMLO's response to all of this? Like, has he, so the Prime Minister, the President or Prime Minister of Mexico, I can't remember.
President of Mexico, yeah.
President of Mexico. Has he largely been coordinating or supporting U.S. policy on migration, or has there been some pushback there? I mean, I know in your book you did mention that he declared that the war on drugs, or the Mexican drug war, was kind of over in 2018. And I don't know what he's said since then, but how would you assess his response to these migration issues?
Yeah, sure. Just to respond to one thing you said there, I think it's a very good point you made about the Republicans as well. I was actually also earlier this year in January, February, I was over on the Piedras Negras Eagle Pass border, where this Take Back Our Border caravan went to, and where they was kind of using this big claim of the military there, stopping the migrants and so forth. One of the things as I was with that, it was interesting. I was talking to two guys, and they were kind of more from a kind of right-wing perspective. I was talking to them there. They were saying they didn't really know the border, and they were like, "Wow, yeah, this is a farce. The Republicans, they're not really interested in solving this issue. They want this bad to campaign on because they got nothing else to run on. So They want us to stay in a bad situation. They're not really solving this." And you see the kind of farce of the way that was done with the, the Take Back Our Border caravan, by the way, was mostly, old guys. The average age was like 75. It wasn't very threatening. I think it wasn't like, there's some big mass mobilization to the border at that point. But also you see the farce of the governors. They had this one park with kind of barbed wire, and all the governors taking photographs with the military behind. And that's just like one tiny little bit on the border. It's like, what difference is it making? And about the desert stuff, I mean, one of the things, so I'm just working on a news story right now. I was put up in Ciudad Juarez, and I was looking at why the numbers of deaths over the desert are just, we're talking about, for the numbers we know, close to 900 deaths in a year on the border now. The most deadly border in the world, and a lot of deaths happening. I was trying to find out what's really changes are there. And one of the worst areas is right next to Ciudad Juarez, in a kind of deserty area called Sunland Park. One of the issues, or some of the issues with this, is you have got bigger numbers, and bigger numbers means more deaths. You have got these more barbed wire areas pushing people out. But also you've got these, among the human smuggling gangs, they call them polleros, the human smugglers. Polleros are like chicken herders, and they call the migrants like chickens. And you've got this kind of new generation. You have this kind of old school generation of older human smugglers who kind of move and take care of the migrants to an extent. And now we were there, it's like young kids. 18, 16, 17, 18, 19, all these ones running a lot of this human smuggling. And there's such high numbers, they're treating people badly, and people are ending up, there's like letting them out, running them in the desert, and they're saying, just go. And they get lost and die there. So some crazy conditions. On your last question about Andres Manuel López Obrador, the president of Mexico. So a fascinating character, and I've followed his career for the last 2 decades, since he was mayor of Mexico City, 3 presidential campaigns. I think, so we're coming to the end of his presidency. I'm kind of getting to, I guess, to his handing over of power. We can maybe make some observations about him or his presidency. I always quite liked his rhetoric. Personally, I think it was his discourse was quite a practical left-wing discourse. It was like, okay, it was left-wing, and it was, make the country more equal, restore communities, restore. It was interesting. It was often about, about values, about kind of neoliberal being just like this kind of idea of everyone for themselves, and this kind of idea of more of a society, more of a nation. I quite liked his discourse, and I can see a lot of people, why they're in favor of him. I think in power, so he called his government the fourth transformation, and said it would be a transformation of Mexico, like the Mexican reform movement under Benito Juárez. This is in the 19th century, the Mexican revolution, and then the Mexican kind of, he said independence, the reform movement, and the revolution were the 3 or 4 transformations. It would be the fourth transformation. When you bill it so high, it's kind of hard to fit that bill of being a transformation of Mexico. I think his presidency overall, I think it's been okay in economic sense. It's been okay. I think politically it's been okay. I think the violence has been terrible, but I think I don't need to get out card too much, but it has been terrible under him and the last 3 presidents. So it's, it was terrible under Calderón, under Peña Nieto, under AMLO, even under Vicente Fox before that. You saw a rise in violence. So it's a bigger, deeper problem that he's failed to confront. But then again, so have other presidents. I think on the he never really figured out, his ideas on the violence. He initially had this idea of a hugs not bullets or end the drug war kind of idea, but then he didn't really follow that through really hard. And then he had another idea, which was more like restoring the power of the state, restoring a national guard. On the economics, and the reason why I think he is popular, and I think why some of the foreign press overplay this kind of attack him as, saying, this kind of, terrible guy, then they have to kind of say, well, this guy's pretty popular, is he did, his rhetoric is popular with many Mexicans. His discourse, how he's saying is popular with many people. Now, it is populist, it is kind of sometimes confrontational and attacking certain journalists and so forth, but still this kind of basic idea of kind of restoring a nation and for the people and having some kind of leadership, and not just kind of being bossed around, is popular with people. And he has kicked back some money into some of these social programs. It was interesting that during the pandemic, he had actually a more austerity program. He didn't run up, borrow loads of money like a lot of presidents did around the world, and a lot of Mexican presidents would have done. And he was like, why borrow loads of money which is going to go into the hands and be ripped off by these rich companies? Now, I do believe a lot of that extra spending that happened in a pandemic in many countries only ended up in the hands of super rich people. And AMLO, he sustained the economy, reasonably well on that. So we'll see. He's leaving power, and it looks like, Claudia Sheinbaum, from his same party, his chosen successor, will become the first female president of Mexico, and then we'll see how she does.
But in terms of his interactions with Biden, because, some people would say that the Democrats are usually better on asylum issues. But if you actually look at the track record, Obama deported far more asylum seekers than Trump, for example. And the policy itself has largely been the same. So is AMLO still sticking to this sort of remain in Mexico policy where there's a concerted effort on the part of the military and other, I guess, police departments to try and prevent people from crossing and to stay in Mexico and not to try and enter the United States?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, good point about Obama deporting more people than Trump. It's a good fact there to remember.
Yeah,
I think with Obama, I would often with the Democrat administrations on this issue, they don't want to be associated with being heavy on migration or heavy on asylum seekers. But the practice is they will try and push back and try and, there's a lot of low-hanging targets for to deport under Obama. And what I mean is covering a lot of the deportations that happened here, and that was part of what made the drug war explode as well. Because loads of people were being deported and then being recruited to cartels and fighting the violence. Again, a lot of these towns where people were being deported. And there was often, it was people with drunk driving, domestic violence, a kind of simple crime, and then bang, you're deported. Beforehand, you'd be processed for a crime but stay in the US. It was deportation. So it kind of changed the dynamic there. And by the time Trump came in, it became people a lot of them, I think the migrant community without papers were being lowered down. So it was wasn't as easy to deport the big numbers. With AMLO, so AMLO was initially, again, like, I know it's fine, people should come here, we're going to give jobs for them and so forth. Both under Obama, under Trump, and under Biden, you see the same thing playing out. Where when you have these large numbers of people coming through Mexico, Mexico will use its National Guard, its military to slow down this migration. And it will do that because generally under a certain, say, duress or under working with the United States, Mexican government generally recognizes it's got $500 billion in trade with the United States, and that's more of its benefit. And it can do this and kind of slow down. Now that's slowing down, which is done, and you've kind of seen almost like this constant up, migrants go up, down a bit, up again, and for the last 10 years. It's only kind of slowing this down in kind of pause things. And they continue to do that. Mexico continues to do that, tries, but it's still, the numbers are, it's doing that right now. And so it's kind of, Biden is trying to keep it out the news till the election. I don't know. It could be huge numbers over the summer. Again, last year, December, I think was the highest month ever. And then Mexican government has been hitting back, but we'll see how much it will hit back on this going to the summer.
Ioan Grillo, it's been great speaking to you. I highly recommend that people read your book, Blood, Gun, Money, and it's right behind you, so people can take a look for it in bookstores, and also that they check out your recent article on how fentanyl has indirectly killed the opium trade as well. That was a really interesting piece. So I highly recommend that people check out your work. Where can they find you online?
Yeah, sure. So check out, if you like, my Substack. I have stories in there. Yeah, so that's a great issue to talk about the opium. This revolution of synthetic drugs and the opium farmers being taken out there. So it's www.crashoutmedia.com. You can see all my stories there, and you can see it's a funny name, IOAN GRILLO. And you can see me on Twitter, or you can see me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and a bunch of places there as well.
Great. So thank you for watching. Thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you enjoy this content and you'd like to support us, feel free to go to our website, theAnalysis.news, the donate button, and get on our mailing list. See you next time.